皆さんこんにちは、アンナです。この番組はしばらくの間無料でご覧いただけます。SNS などでシェアしていただけると嬉しいです。夜の放送も含めた過去の放送は YouTube のメンバーシップにご登録いただくといつでも好きな時に見放題になります。また、こちら2つの上位プランもご用意してまして、これらにアップグレードいただくと上位プラン向けの限定動画も見られます。皆様ぜひご登録、アップグレードいただければ番組継続のためにご協力いただければと思います。はい。ではですね、本日はイギリス出身のジャーナリストで、イモーショナルレイバーという本を、お書きになった著者のローズ・ハックマンさんをゲストで、お呼びしております。彼女はイギリスの大手新聞社ガーディアンにてジェンダー、人種、労働、警察、環境問題などを主なテーマとして記事を書いていらっしゃって、今もアメリカの社会問題について啓蒙するための記事を書かれています。で、その中で特に感情労働というテーマを取り上げてらっしゃって、それを一冊の本にまとめたものが今年発売となりました。はい。では、本日お迎えしています、ローズ・ハックマンさんです。はい。Hello, Rose. Nice to have you on the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for being here. Before we get started, if you could say a brief hello to our audience, that would be great.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. I'm so excited to be speaking about emotional labor with you today. And I'm excited to hear how it meets Japanese audiences.
Thank you so much. So right off the bat, before we get started, I kind of want to discuss with you the actual definition of what emotional labor is, as I imagine this could be quite a foreign concept to some of our viewers. So the definition I got, and you're more than welcome to add or tweak the definition that I have with me. It's that emotional labor is a process of managing feelings and expressions to fulfill the emotional requirement of a job. And major examples of this as a profession are teachers, childcare workers, and nurses, and etc. And I'll repeat that in Japanese. So, 感情労働というのが今回の本のテーマなんですが、これは、仕事の遂行のために感情や表情、表現を管理すること、肉体労働、頭脳労働に加わる3つ目の労働形態で、感情の抑制や忍耐などが絶対的に求められるお仕事を指します。で、主な例として教員、保育士、看護師などが、挙げられています。So I know this is quite a simple definition, but I know that you've been working on this topic for many years now. And if there's anything that you want to add to this definition, or if there's something that you want to kind of point out before we go into the discussions, I would love to welcome that.
Sure. So exactly as you said, emotional labor was coined as a term 40 years ago by a amazing sociologist called Ali Hochschild. And she was exactly as you just described, describing the way in which increasingly in a service economy, workers were being required to manage their feelings, to regulate, modulate their emotions in order to have an effect on the emotions of other people. It was first and foremost studied as a completely professional concept, something that people were just doing at work. But Ali Hochschild 40 years ago equated that form of work with a feminized form of work that we were very used to seeing women do in private, which at the time she called emotion work. And now the two terms, especially in non-academic circles, have merged so that emotional labor does refer to the way in which people in the workplace are going to do this kind of emotion regulation to have an effect on the emotions of other people. But we also talk about it and understand it as something happening in unpaid private spheres too.
And as we get into the discussion, it's rather the unpaid bit that's more the issue, isn't it, than perhaps the gendered work in itself, maybe.
I think the two are in conversation with each other, I think. I think the way in which we render this form of work invisible in private, and we just say it's women being women, ends up being one of the reasons why we disparage certain kinds of work in the formal workplace. But I'm very happy to get to that as we go into our conversation.
All right, yeah, let's dive in. So I have quite a few questions for you, and I had the pleasure of reading your book, Emotional Labor, which is sadly not translated into Japanese. So hopefully, if there are viewers here that's working for the literary world, then hopefully they are paying attention, because I really certainly hope that this book does get translated into Japanese soon. But first, before we get into the content, I really found it interesting that your profession is a journalist, and that I find that this topic of emotional labor to be quite an academic term. And I know that those two worlds coincide with one another often, but I just wanted to ask you about your journey of why did you find this to be a topic of your focus? And after that, in the book, you added some of your interviewees' voices, and we find a lot of quotes in there, and I found that to be very inspiring. And it was very easy to visualize what they were going through because of those quotes. But why did you decide to add those quotes in there along with your academic citations?
Thank you. So I am a journalist by training. I, for many years in my 20s, was a journalist, a features writer for The Guardian into my 30s. And really what I covered as a journalist here in the United States, I'm British, but I've been here for a decade and a half now. I covered structural inequality. And actually, as much as I've always considered myself a feminist, I didn't necessarily do that much gender. I was very interested in labor, policing, housing, a lot of the race inequality, a lot of these structural, very deeply entrenched problems that we've become maybe accustomed to and yet still feel very unjust. In 2015, I was living in New York at the time. My features editor at The Guardian, who's a wonderful French woman called Jessica Reed, came bounding up to me, very excited. She said, I've got this amazing article idea for you. It's just up your alley. It's emotional labor as the next feminist frontier. And, at the time, and I think this is really important to say, because I think it really captures some of the prejudice that people might have about this as a topic. I had prejudice too. So at the time when my editor said, you should do this, I thought, this sounds a bit silly. This sounds a bit just like a small issue. I'd fought really hard to be someone who could tackle very heavy weight issues. And I thought, this sounds a bit like a complaint of like privileged women who are just complaining that their husbands aren't picking up their socks. And I started researching it and talking to not just academics, but as you just mentioned, people who were doing this as part of their jobs, people who were having issues, real issues in their relationships, not privileged women across social classes. And I started to realize that this is a really huge problem that is drastically misunderstood. And so I wrote an article in The Guardian in the fall of 2015, which is 8 years ago now. And that really started my journey on this book, because I deeply felt that one article once that was very widely circulated was actually not enough. I wanted to start a much bigger conversation. And actually, I believe that the fact that I'm not an academic is a strength here, because there is a lot of research in academia, but a lot of people don't read academic papers, And I thought that what I really wanted to do is bring a lot of the academic research that gave us very clear vision of the way in which some people were doing emotional labor, some people were not doing emotional labor, some of the ways in which it was extracted for free. I could take that and then combine it with, as you just mentioned, stories of everyday people who are really able to share their experience and then share the way in which this comes up in their life and can sometimes feel very damaging or upsetting. So as a journalist, I always like to try and bring real numbers and academic research and combine it with anecdotes so that people can actually understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I really, again, for me, it made it really easier to imagine real life examples of emotional labor. And to my surprise, how much of it I was doing unconsciously as kind of like a second nature kind of thing, as being trained as a little girl to perform these labor, even as a child, right? So, and I also noticed that some of your interviewees, some of them are very aware that they were engaging in emotional labor, but some of them were not. And I think you left it at that as kind of that's how they are at the moment, right? So what were your kind of, I guess, was there any battle having so much information that you do? And perhaps when you're interviewing these people, you realize, oh, yes, what you're doing is emotional labor, or the environment that you're in is actually, problematic, or, whatever it may be. And just kind of stopping yourself there and just, having that to be where the period is. I myself found myself to be a little bit frustrated because I was like, oh, why can't you see, this is a problem. So kind of your experience on that there.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know. I didn't understand 10 years ago what this was. I could feel, I certainly had been in a lot of different situations where I had a feeling of injustice. For example, and the thing is with emotional labor is it's one of the most intimate forms of injustices, even if it's in the workplace, because effectively the way in which emotional labor currently is done is one person is going to be taking on the responsibility for the well-being of the people around them.
Right.
And is going to be expected to mute themselves, to alter themselves, and to constantly be playing this game of, tuning my emotions up or tuning my emotions down, constantly thinking and centering the people around her. And that is often, a feminized trait. The truth is, part of this whole book is trying to rectify the fact that people don't know what it is. To me, it's so extraordinary because emotional labor is at the center of so many of these jobs. If a nurse is not kind, is not thoughtful, if a customer care, representative, you call up to complain about something and they're really rude to you and they refuse to do emotional labor because they're having a bad day or whatever it is, you're going to be appalled. You're going to be saying that they're not doing their job. And what is their job? Their job is emotional labor.
Right.
But yet, we still don't understand it as a real form of work alongside physical labor, intellectual labor, creative labor. And that is because we just see it as women being women, or just something that's just there that we can't quite name. So yeah, the whole book is an effort to say, no, it's there. It's extraordinarily valuable. It's also running entire economies because it's the center of so many jobs. And we need to finally have a conversation about what this is.
So kind of related to that topic, I kind of want to discuss on the visibility and invisibility of emotional labor. And Professor Michael Kimmel, who is active in the men's group activities and sociology surrounding that, he's once said the privilege is invisible to those who have it. And this quote kind of has always stuck with me. And this is a prime example, in my opinion, on how invisible this is to those who do not have to perform this emotional labor. And kind of going into this duality or the paradox of emotional labor, that is, it is to mask your emotion for the benefit of others. Therefore, the others will not know, hopefully, or the purpose of it is to not know what your true emotions are. And so in my opinion, it adds another layer of invisibility than perhaps other social issues that we might have. And so, but then, in order for it to be truly valued and evaluated, it needs to be visibilized. And in the book, you mentioned one study where men and women are both equally capable of showing empathy, yet men tend to show them more when there are financial compensation for it. So, they're able to be empathetic, or when they are able to show emotional labor when it's, learning a boss's preference, or, learning a client's favorite restaurant, right? So that's not an issue. But when they come home to their partner, they can't take out a trash that's been asked to do 3 days ago, right? So because there's no financial compensation. So this is kind of where I find very interesting. And so can we kind of talk about this invisibility and the difference between the male-female dynamic, and how it's not really the capacity of men and women, but it's the motive behind it. So yeah, yes.
Definitely. There's a lot there. So I'll start with what you initially talked about, which is how can we make it visible? And I think it goes back to my previous answer, which is people pretend they can't see someone doing good emotional labor until someone starts withholding it. Or specifically someone they expect to be doing it starts withholding it. So we are very sensitive to its absence. We just have an entitlement that certain people should be doing it constantly. And I know that tipping is a very American institution, but in the US, if a server in a restaurant comes up to you and, just like takes your order, but is like very, again, rude, or not smiling, not checking in with you, just like can't be bothered because maybe, something's happening with them at home. We're going to be like, I'm not going to tip you because you did not do a good job. You did not do emotional labor again. And I think it's the same in family settings. A mother is expected to be endlessly empathetic and preemptively helpful. And if she's not, she's very quickly going to be branded a very bad, very bad parent, a very bad partner, whatever it is. So, to Michael Kimmel's quote that you had, one of the fascinating, and I think you're pinpointing it perfectly, things with emotional labor is if someone's doing it really well, it's going to feel very authentic. And so therefore, it's going to create that experience of seamlessness, that everything is actually, this is just how things are happening. Because effectively, if the definition of emotional labor is the editing work of emotions you will do on yourself in order to have an effect on the emotions of other people, for example, a smile, that you will give regardless of whether you're feeling good inside, in order to make the other people around you feel good inside. That emotional labor is supposed to make other people feel like you're feeling like that. And it's also centering their emotions, their experience, and decentering your emotions and your experience. In that dynamic, especially between men and women, because emotional labor as it currently stands is offloaded onto women. We expect women to do it for the benefit of men and society at large. Effectively, what we're telling women is men are the ones who get to enjoy experiences, and we are the ones who are expected to create the experiences for the men. So of course, when you're in the middle of having an experience created for you and everyone's running around, and if you are having a bad day and you feel very angry, for example, you're not going to feel like you have to temper your anger at all. But the people around you, the women, we've been trained to manage your mood. We've been trained to whatever we might be angry too, but we've been trained to put those emotions to the side and to think, how am I going to bring this person's mood, down to a good level? How can I cheer him up? Whatever it is. So how do you start seeing that? I think, it's a kind of, it sounds very abstract, but I think actually it's very concrete. Once people start to understand what emotional labor is, they start to see it and understand that they're not, their experience isn't the only experience in the universe. Surprise, surprise. The other person is also having an emotional experience. And I think the balance, which I guess we're going to get to in a bit, but, to maybe hint at that, the balance is it's not just about everyone being responsible for their own emotions. It's a combination of understanding your own emotions and taking accountability for yourself within an emotional network. And it has to go both ways. So I guess I kind of, maybe I went a bit ahead of myself.
No, you're perfect. Yeah.
And I guess the second part of the question was motivation. So yes, I'm so happy you mentioned that. I think, and I wonder how I know that gender stereotypes in Japan might be somewhat different, but certainly in the Western culture I grew up in, there is this fundamental idea that women are people pleasers, women are other oriented, we're quote unquote, because it's not true, we're naturally empathetic. And so this trains us into doing preemptively, including from very, very young age, it trains us putting other people's feelings above our own. If we're not doing that, we're told we're selfish and we're very much reprimanded. And we understand that, being thoughtful and putting other people first, good, not doing that, bad, we will get penalized. So let's do it constantly. So there is a motivation that we have in order to not be penalized within society to, perform that empathy. Men don't have that same motivation. Men are encouraged to be aggressive, dominant. They're encouraged to be competitive. They're encouraged to center themselves, because we do live in a patriarchal society where men are centered. So neuroscientists and psychologists for many years, could see that there was a difference in empathy between the sexes, between genders. But they started over the last really 20 years and with advances in neuroscience, you can understand the brain much more. They started to understand that actually empathy is not necessarily inherent, it's motivational. So if you're incentivized to be empathetic, to be thoughtful, you will be more likely to perform that trait. And if you're disincentivized, then you won't be bothered. And so I'm so glad you mentioned the money element. I don't think inherently men are able only to be more empathetic and thoughtful and remember things if they're motivated by money. It's just that money is a very motivating, it's a very motivating element, especially in our society. And so there are these wonderful studies that show that the same groups of men and women who can have differences in empathy levels when only one group is motivated through, gender stereotype, and when they do exactly the same study, but with the motivation of money, suddenly men's performance just shoots through the roof. And I think, to bring it back to anecdotal evidence, I think we all understand this in our everyday. A man who goes, let's say, who works in a white collar job, who goes to work, who knows to be, who has a boss, let's say, who knows that he should not be super dominant and aggressive with his boss, and who knows that his boss likes this and doesn't like that, is going to be able, if he wants to advance, is going to be motivated into catering to that boss's emotions. And that same man might come home and say, exactly as you're saying, say he can't remember, oh, I'm just not good at remembering birthdays. I'm just not remembering, people's names. Oh, I don't know what we're doing next week. It's like, that is actually doesn't make any sense. And it's just that home, that motivation has disappeared. And so those traits and that labor is no longer being done.
And on that, I want to talk about this concept of emotional labor in relationship. And as you mentioned earlier, that this whole concept of emotional labor to begin with was a very much a economic labor environment idea, right? So you're working as, at at a hotel and you're giving them the best experience that they can get, and that is an emotional labor. But then, as you mentioned, this emotion work and emotional labor is kind of starting to merge in the recent years, and we start to realize that this labor is happening inside our private spheres as well. And I found this topic to be more eye-opening in my personal experience. And so and my master plan behind this all is that I'm trying to introduce this to Japan and trying to be like, hey guys, this is what we're doing inside our homes. And so I kind of want to discuss this with you, and hopefully you can give us some examples of this, some of the maybe emotional work that women might be doing at home with our partners and with our families and with our friends. So if you could give us a few examples, and if we can talk about it, I think that would be great for our viewers.
I'm very happy to. So there's a lot of different ways in which emotional labor will show up in private dynamics. The first very obvious way, if you're effectively being expected to put your emotions and your time to work for the positive emotional experience of the people around you in a family setting, that can look like someone checking in with other people, let's say about how their day went. That can also mean someone seeing that, let's say their romantic partner, let's say it's a wife and a husband, seeing that their husband is maybe in a bad mood and trying to figure out how to lift that mood up. It's, if that couple has children, it's going to be the one who, in a very literal way, is going to be in charge of making sure that the kids are, happy and functional. And if they're not, trying to figure out what those emotions are, and helping, so much of child rearing is helping kids develop an emotional language, not just about themselves, but about the world. So that's the very literal emotional labor that is going to be going on in family settings and in private settings. But then when you kind of step back and you think, okay, emotional labor is also effectively putting your emotions to serve the emotional experience of other people. That can end up having a lot of knock-on consequences in terms of what you might do. So you talked about friends, it can also, in a friend group, it might be the one who is expected or who takes on the kind of boring tasks so that other people do not have to do those boring tasks. A lot of the time, the person who's doing that is doing that because they're saving other people from that boredom. They're catering to other people's emotions, and they're doing the sacrifice for the group. Very often, the idea of being the one who takes the high road, being the one who does the sacrifices for the group, is really about putting other people's emotions first and your emotions second. There's nothing wrong with being a people pleaser. There's nothing wrong. In some ways, I can be a people pleaser. But where it becomes unjust and where it becomes, for some people, untenable, is when there is only one person doing the compromises, taking the high road, making the personal sacrifices. And then there's all the other people, or certainly the one other person who is constantly being sent and constantly getting to enjoy the experiences. And I know in the US, we have I think across the world, we have a pay, gender pay gap.
Right.
And there's a lot of different ways of explaining that gender pay gap. But one of the biggest ways in which we can still explain that gender pay gap is just with that very basic choice that happens after a couple has a child. The person in dual income households where both people are working, the person who's going to be expected to stay home is the mother. And that sure might be because of she had the baby and of course she has to recover. But there's also an idea that if someone's going to, step back from their career, if someone gets to, continue leaning into the career, that's going to be very, very gendered. Woman is going to make a sacrifice. Man is going to get to, to keep on pushing, doing whatever it is. And another quick way of understanding the inequality in heterosexual, households is to look at the leisure, that the data that shows, or time use surveys, basically data that shows what people get to do with their day, not just in terms of going to formal work, but when they get home from work. And what we see, including in again, dual income households where both people work, is men have almost 1 extra hour of leisure time a day. And that means that the man, again, is going to be seen as the person who gets to enjoy, his, not just his life at work, but his life when he gets home. And women are not going to be able to have those spaces and the same amount of time, certainly as they stand, to be the ones who enjoy, because they are creating, the enjoyment for others.
And personally, I found this to be very relatable on a personal level. And this reminded me of, I think, a TikTok that went a bit viral this year about a Mother's Day organization. And so there was this one very distressed woman who, sorry, my memory escapes me, but was organizing a Mother's Day event, whether for her child or her own mother. And, despite the fact that she herself is a mother, she has to be the one to organize this event because her children are babies, right? So they're not going to voluntarily, write a card or buy her a present. So she has to be the one to, organize this Mother's Day event. And, it's not that their husbands are unwilling, it's that they're not even thinking of doing this, and that in order for her to allocate this labor, she has to tell the husband that I want you to organize this Mother's Day event, which in itself is already labor. And I found that to be very interesting because it reminds me of a time where I'm a firstborn daughter. So I remember, I don't even remember how old I was, but at some point I began to be the person who bought Mother's Day cards in our household, and my father would just sign it. But I was the one to go to CVS and buy a card, $2, really not a big deal. And really, I wasn't really thinking of it as labor, but thinking back, it was passed down from a woman to woman. It was my mother organizing these family events and whatnot, buying gifts and cards. And then it was not passed down to my father, it was passed down to me, the firstborn daughter. So it never went through a man. And so that's kind of an idea that reminded me in my life. And so when I saw that TikTok of the woman just being very upset about, this Mother's Day event, and rightfully so, it just hurt my heart. And it just made me wonder why, these husbands weren't able to do this for their wives. And I kind of wanted to get your input on that. And I know it's a very widely experienced phenomenon as well. So.
Totally. I mean, first I want to say, when so much of your time and energy is dedicated towards being thoughtful and thinking of others and then putting that into action, when there is one day a year when you're supposed to get celebrated,
right,
and for just a few minutes, the people around you, the person next to you, you realize is just not even going to bother to do just a few minutes what you are effectively doing 365 days a year. I mean, it is very upsetting. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is this is an injustice that can feel very, very small, ends up having massive consequences in terms of how we organize our society. But in those very small moments, those small moments of injustice are everything. It's small, but it's just speaking to the fact that potentially you're in a relationship where one person is effectively not proactively caring
They've checked out, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it is, it is upsetting. So I just wanted to say that first, but then I want to get to your question. And now, because I went to all that, can you remind me exactly what your question was? Sorry.
I think it was the, on Mother's Day was the example, but in a lot of these, family events and so on and so forth, we see that, Mother's Day, same day every year, right? It's not, at random. Everybody knows it's happening. All the internet commercials are all Mother's Day. So the society makes sure to remind us that Mother's Day is coming. And yet, the husbands, the dads, they kind of, some of them fail to show up for their partners. And you don't see this parallel with Father's Day, right? I think a lot of my, female friends who are mothers, they make sure that on Father's Day, they are, the dads are being celebrated, or they call their dads and so on and so forth. But why do you think that this kind of, like you said, it's a one day a year where mothers are to be celebrated out of all the 365 days? Why, why do you think they just check out? Because it's easy as buying a card, yet this isn't something, and they know well from practice that if they don't do it, it's going to upset their partner, right? So to me, I have a hard time understanding that.
I think there are two broad explanations here. One is a more generous explanation, and the other one is a more cynical one. And I think that depending on the situation, a bit of, one or the other applies. I think the first one is actually what mostly in society, a lot of us are going to say to excuse effectively this kind of behavior, effectively to excuse it's careless, right? We're going to say, oh, men are just like that. This is just obliviousness. This is just, they're just hopeless. Ha ha ha. I'll, wrap my own present and, under the Christmas tree or whatever, or obviously in this case, it's Mother's Day or my own birthday present. It's easier for me to, this is what, my mother, who's a wonderful mother, I remember my mother doing this with my dad saying, when her birthday came around, she was like, oh, it's just easier for me to buy my own present from your father because I know what I want and then it saves him. And it's just like, but presents aren't about necessarily getting what you want. Presents are about communicating, one person communicating to the other person, I love you or I care for you. And I've put time and energy and thought into this object that is effectively a representation, a symbol of the fact that I care about you. That's really what these moments are. It's not about spending money or getting something that you want. So that first explanation is obliviousness. Honestly, the second explanation, the more cynical one, is, we have a society that is built around male entitlement. We have a society that is built around male selfishness, that justifies it, that enables it. We are in a society that prioritizes time after time, men's space, men's experience. And in the moments where men have to flip the script and suddenly perform for the women in their lives and actually show up for the women in their lives. Obviously, some of them have become too comfortable with this centering to actually do, again, just a few minutes of time and effort and energy that is emotional labor to show up, for the other people in their lives in the same way. It kind of goes back to that stark inequality that is part of what, with this book, and I hope, with a growing movement of awareness, we start to really address the inequality. I don't think ultimately it's not just that it doesn't make women happy. I think that fundamentally, not emotionally showing up in relationships like when you're a father or a husband or a brother, I think ultimately that doesn't make men happy either.
No, it doesn't. Right. And I think you touch on that as well. And, what about the men section? And that this, it's misogyny and patriarchy as a whole, right, is that it doesn't really benefit men. And yet they uphold it because that's what they're taught. And that is still very puzzling to me. But as we move forward, I think we'll go into perhaps like this gendered notion of love. But before we get into that, I kind of want to touch on this difference between how emotional labor might look like in the West versus in Asia, specifically in Japan. And I think you mentioned cultures like tipping, where that doesn't really exist in Japan. But we do have a very much this cultural value or the societal norm of this collective harmony, and that our individualistic needs should not surpass this collective benefit. Right. So that's kind of what we live by. That's kind of the unspoken rule here. And it's and to some extent, because of this, I believe that Japanese men and women perform emotional labor more so than perhaps their Western counterparts. So when we talk about this issue, I feel that men in the audience, the Japanese men in the audience, I feel that they can relate to some of this emotional labor that they're performing, because as a collective, we're expected to do this, I feel, more so than other parts of the world. But even then, Japan is ranked like very low in the gender equality index, embarrassingly. And so I believe that this emotional labor is more expected from Japanese women more so than in other parts of the world, as I've lived both in the United States and Japan and a little bit in Britain. And so, like, for example, when we talk about the literal emotional labor that is in the labor force, and we see less and less of this, but it back in the day, it was normal that women were the one to kind of pour tea for their work peers or their work guests. When there was a guest at a work environment, it was always the women who were supposed to pour the tea and give it to them. Or more so in the modern days, nowadays they kind of try to make that less of an issue by providing like bottled teas instead of the actual like pouring the tea with all that ceremonial stuff. But nowadays it's more like how women are the ones who end up picking up all the dirty mugs at the end of the day from workforce, things like this. And so the whole point, I think, and you say this in your book as well, is to kind of identify these emotional labor because it's so invisible and because we're just so trained to do this, and we do this kind of without really thinking much, and it's the norm, right? And I really want to kind of bring this into light of some of the examples that this women might be doing. And so I know that you're not part of the Japanese cultural sphere, but maybe perhaps you've spoken to maybe Asian American. I know that you've spoken to Miss Michigan. And so what do you think are the difference in these cultures and how emotional labor might show up in different ways?
Yeah. It's interesting because a couple of the people that I interviewed in the early research days of the book were political scientists who were American, but had done studies across a lot of different countries of emotional labor.
Right.
And they said exactly which makes sense. They said exactly what you said, which is, as much as emotional labor is not, it's not really understood anywhere properly, even if it's studied in academia. When they went to Asia, specifically East Asia, they found that the people that they talked to, even if they didn't know the term, immediately connected to the term because it was such a part of the culture.
Right.
Way more than in, the Western world. So I think that the inputs that I can give just generally that could be useful here is twofold. So one of the things that, as things currently stand, and I think it does go across society, different societies, is the fact that emotional labor is inherently not about gender. It's not inherently about ethnicity. It's about power.
Right.
So whoever is seen to have less power in a group is going to be the one who is going to be expected to do the most emotional labor as things stand. The person who has the least power in a group is going to be expected to put their emotions the most to work for the benefit and enjoyment of the people at the center of the group. And I think that even in societies and cultures where there is much more of a value put on, in this case, collective harmony, I think where you're going to see the inequalities is in our specific groups doing it more than other groups.
Right.
And because in a society where everyone's doing it equally, that's wonderful. But I think that, in societies that are still patriarchal, which my understanding is Japan certainly is.
Yes.
I would expect that because of this gender inequality core dynamic at the heart of the patriarchy, even if there is going to be an understanding of what emotional labor is, there is certainly going to be an expectation that women should continue, probably, continuously, chronically be providing this form of work in a way that men are not necessarily going to have to do the same. I think, sounds like you mentioned maybe white collar work environments that have obviously increasingly across the world become more and more integrated in terms of gender. But studies are very clear in that they show that even when a woman, say, works in, I don't know, let's say she works in a law firm as a lawyer, and she has the same qualifications as her male lawyer counterparts, she is still often going to be expected to perform an added shift of emotional labor and of feminine type work. We are still expecting women in these white collar environments to be maybe metaphorically pouring the tea, and what that ends up doing is it ends up straddling women with an extra, basically, layer of expectation, an extra layer and an extra shift of work that they have to do in order to be seen as competent. So there's an added set of expectations that can feel very unfair. But also, when we're requiring women who are lawyers to effectively act as support staff to their male counterparts, there's ends up being a way in which we end up reminding women in these small ways that we say, oh, but that's just, tradition. We end up reminding women effectively of their subordinate position, of their second-class status. And I think when we have conversations about why it's hard, this is in white-collar environments, why it's still hard for women to get to the top, I think we have to have a conversation that goes beyond saying to women, oh, you just need to be more like men, and acknowledges all of these double standards that women in the workplace.
Right. And which is what you write about in the book as well, about like the criticism about, the lean-in feminism and so on and so forth. And I would also, like to add that to those who have the option to, quote unquote, act like a man in a corporate situation are already privileged. So, already this lean-in approach is only an option to a handful of people. So, that was kind of, I think where the criticism came, in that it was very much a white feminism take, is that, who is able to sit in a corporate table who is a woman, right? So already there's a number of filters that go into people who can lean in, right? So that is pretty much a point I feel is still something that we need to work on. And I think a lot of the new generation feminists are doing a great job of kind of dissecting this and kind of trying to thrive in femininity, and that you don't need to be a man to be successful, and dissecting this kind of, success equals masculine quotation. But yes, and, when we kind of touched on this as we spoke thus far, but I do want to kind of talk about this balance between virtue and labor, and this could be in a Japanese context as well, and that, it's good to care for others. It's good to think of others and act accordingly. And in your book, I think it was the man who did the gardening and who was very in touch with himself. When you gave him the idea of this emotional labor, quote, he was very surprised and was like, emotions are work women are forced into, was kind of the reaction that he had, and he was quite puzzled. But I can really hear a lot of my friends giving me the same reactions, especially my male friends. And some of the things he said was that, why is it the fact that women provide emotional support work? Why is it just women though, right? So men do it too kind of mentality. And also, you know, what if they actually enjoy it? Or what if women are inherently better at it? Or, you know, ultimately it's like, why do you have to make it a negative thing, right? It's good that they're acting in the interest of others, and what, you know, and so on and so forth. And so I think when I introduced this idea to the Japanese society, I feel that that's probably going to be the main reaction. It's like, why? Because it's so widely practiced as well, is that it's a good thing, right? You're acting for others. You are doing the best in your capacity so that other people can, you know, live in harmoniously, or live in a good mood, or can have a good day, or whatever it may be. And so, and we talked about reciprocation, but how do you think that I, for example, as an individual, can identify this balance between I should be a good person versus I'm being used essentially of my goodwill?
I think it goes, you know, to the idea of balance. Mm-hmm. So I want to touch on a few things because you're quite wonderfully nuanced. But I think to answer the last part, we need to, as things stand, emotional labor is often rendered invisible. It's often devalued. It's often offloaded onto the people that we care about the least. But emotional labor, which is what I argue, should be not just seen, it should be valued. If it's in a work context, it deserves to be rewarded because it is creating value. And just generally, it needs to be shared across the board. So the problem is not emotional labor in and of itself. The problem is its massively unequal distribution. To go back to the man you're speaking of, who's very good at tending to his plants. Can men do emotional labor? Do men do emotional labor? Yes, 100% they can and they do. What I'm arguing for, and I think what a lot of people are starting to argue for, is that they should do more of it. You know, if I'm good at something, if a man is very tall and strong and is very good at cutting down trees, and let's say he's very good at cutting down trees and he enjoys cutting down trees, would we say that he's not doing physical labor? No, we would never say that he's doing physical labor.
Right.
So the fact that this is something that can be enjoyed and that some people are good at has nothing to do with is it work or not. The reason we say it's not work is because as things stand in our society, anything that touches the feminine is basically, we render all of the feminized traits, whether it's domestic work, whether it's emotional labor, whether it's aesthetics work, we render all of that invisible, and we say it can't be work, because effectively the way in which we've set up our society is, even to this day, as women are in the workforce far more, we've set up our society that we see men as doing the kind of main work and women as doing the support work. I think the reason there is such a pressing conversation that we need to have now is because society has drastically shifted. Men are no longer the ones who are doing this quote unquote productive labor only. And as women join them in the productive workforce, they're realizing that all of the support work that has been so essential to the smooth running of communities, of families, of economies, is still being offloaded onto them, and it suddenly feels extremely unfair and unequal. And honestly, you know, one of the big conversations that I'm sure is also happening in Japan, that's been happening here, is automation. You know, the irony and what's kind of hilarious about automation is that I think there's a kind of a classism that's been going on for a long time in terms of people in power not necessarily caring about automation as much as they could have done. But now that automation is also coming after quote unquote hard skills, not just physical labor, but intellectual labor, now that effectively AI can do a lot of the work that lawyers do, or accountants do, or even doctors do. We're seeing that the one form of work that cannot be replaced is that human-to-human connective work, emotional labor.
And we saw that during COVID, right? It was the one thing that people couldn't replace was those essential workers, and who, and it was, I think as a collective, we realized how human interaction and empathy was so important to us, and that, this work culture was quite secondary, right? So that was quite a collective realization, I feel.
Totally. And I think that as these technologies continue to advance, we're going to really, I hope, because actually a world that still sticks to these, it's very, I find it very hypocritical to not see, emotional labor as work when, again, it's the center of so many jobs that we can't replace. It's the center of also a functional family and a functional community. You don't have a functional family without someone who's tending to the emotions and the experiences and the needs of others. You don't have a family. So I do find it hypocritical, but what's kind of ironic about this moment is we're in a tense moment where people are still saying, oh, this is ridiculous, emotional labor as work, it's not work. And in fact, my argument is, it's not just that it's work, it's kind of the future of work, because it's the only skill that, we can get a robot to imitate emotional labor, but because as humans, we only survive, we need feelings of connection and meaning and belonging to survive. We can't fully automate that. There's no way we can.
Right. Because like you said, authenticity is key to emotional labor, right? As authentic as it is, the better it is, right? The more real, the more comfort you receive. So, like you're right, the person who is best at emotional labor is something who can actually feel the authenticity or portray the authenticity well enough for the others to believe it.
And I mean, this is very deep in the neuroscience, but emotion contagion is something that we see in our brains as real. So if I am a human and I am communicating with another human, if I am communicating positive emotions and energy, other humans, it's neurons. Their neurons are going to receive it. It's going to have an actual, my brain and emotional output is going to have a measurable impact on the brain and, emotional reception of the person next to me. It's kind of amazing.
And talking about the future, I want to go on to the last question I have for you is, where do we go from here, essentially? And, kind of this idea of love or even empathy is something that's already quite gendered, and which is probably another added issue to this whole concept of emotional labor is, loving and being empathetic is so gendered that even though, to me, it seems quite obvious that we need to be empathetic as a whole, but no matter what gender you identify with. And yet we can't really come to that understanding yet from our male counterparts a lot of the times. And so I think this, not only is it from personally, it's an issue of emotional labor, but I ask you this as a role model, and this is something that I come to a wall in many of feminist issues, is that where do we go from here, right? We realize that, patriarchy is not benefiting men. We realize that misogyny doesn't benefit men. In fact, it harms them, right? And they're, no matter what they tell themselves, they're not enjoying whatever it is that the system expects them to. And, at the core of human experience, loving someone and being empathetic to someone is actually quite a joyous thing, and that men being deprived of that is causing, it is at the root of many issues that we face. And like we've agreed before, it should be something that men want, right? They should want to love and they should want to be empathetic because it's such a positive experience. And yet we're having such a hard time conveying that to 50% of our population. And I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that from the perspective of even in emotional labor. Where do we go from here? We've identified the issue. What do we do now?
So the short answer is massive. And sadly, I don't think anything short of it is going to be useful, which is we have to have a radical shift in our collective value system. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that saying that might sound overwhelming because it sometimes feel like we're in a world that is immovable. Mm-hmm. But anyone who understands gender and systems of power understands that the systems of power, whether it's gender or race or class, are being reproduced constantly. Mm-hmm. You know, these small moments where your male coworker who you have exactly the same qualifications as is asking you to metaphorically pour tea for him. Mm-hmm. Like those small moments is what reproduces gender inequality. Mm-hmm. So actually, all of these systems are much more fragile than it can sometimes feel. Mm-hmm. And I think that you're so right to contextualize this conversation within broader feminism, because I think that if we think of a lot of the feminist gains, not just over the last 70 years, but even like 100 years in terms of getting the right to vote, you know, being able to have access to a lot of the economic opportunities that our male counterparts had access to. A lot of these rights, they seemed to make us on a par with men, but they didn't. And the reason they didn't is because we continued to value things that we saw as masculine, and we continue to devalue things, I shouldn't say things, we continue to devalue traits and skills and activities that we saw as feminine. There was, instead of having a collective reckoning with the totally, it's kind of random that we've placed more value on one set of traits than on the other, except it's not, because all of the traits we place value on are very often masculine, and all of the traits that we say, oh, but that doesn't really have value, we can't, it's, you know, sure, it's valuable, but it's so valuable that we can't really place a real value on it, which is, you know, let's say care and, again, emotional labor. This is a moment where part of saying we need to see emotional labor and we need to value it and we need to share it is finally reckoning with the fact that not just women, but all of what we have seen as feminine has a tremendous value, essential value. And when you talk about the fact that it's very hard to get men, you know, to perform the same care and love that women do. And we know that that's not based on inherent ability, because we know from neuroscience and psychology that because as humans, the primary way in which we relate to the world is through our emotions, and the primary way in which we survive is because of someone doing that work of love for us so that we can actually survive. We know that men are just as receptive to this and just as able than women are. But they're threatened in them, as things stand, you know, to be a very caring, loving, empathetic man is not to access high status. So it's what we need to change is the way in which we see value and status. And that is a huge ask. It's not, you know, this is certainly not a self-help book where, I mean, there are tips. There's definitely, you know, I definitely wanted tips in there for people who are navigating interpersonal relationships. I also wanted to bring clarity to some of these injustices and double standards that people face in the workplace, which I hope is very validating. But fundamentally, the solution is drastic normative change that can only happen the more people like you and I have conversations, and you know, the more also hopefully we are able to reckon with the reality of the world. I would like to just add that, as you know, because you very kindly read the book, you know, there's this wonderful anecdote of this American anthropologist, Margaret Mead, who contends in a famous lecture that the birth of civilization, of modern civilization, as she sees it. She asks her students to weigh in. And certainly in, American society, especially over the last, with the industrial age and post-industrial age, there's this idea that competition and domination and aggression are the kind of core values. And those are all seen as masculine.
Mm-hmm.
But Margaret Mead, in this lecture in the early 20th century, she says, no, the birth of modern civilization is not someone creating the wheel or a pot. It's not, the sign of, let's say, a sword of someone being aggressive. It's a healed femur, which is a bone. And she says, this healed femur is the symbol of one person stopping what they're doing and helping someone else heal. Someone couldn't have healed from having this broken bone in ancient times if they didn't have someone else helping them to heal. And I think that if we can think of the fact that as humans, the reason we have actually thrived as a species generally is because we have an ability to collaborate, because we actually are group animals. We need each other. We kind of come together and we figure out together how to feed ourselves, how to meet, basic needs. Emotional labor is at the core of that superpower. And I think that we've gone away from it. And I think there is an arrogance with which we've gone away from it. And I think it's time we change that.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I really hope that we can come to that. And I think in the recent years, we are starting to see this kind of this up, down, like this change in specifically in academia, where, maybe certain academic findings which was credited to men are now actually being credited to women, or, one quote from your book, from the part Radical Love in New World, you write, you have a quote from Chamorro Music that says, from the book, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders? And the quote is, instead of focusing on what is wrong with women, understand why they're not rising to positions of leadership more. We need to look at what is wrong with the system's way of interacting with men. And I think that's exactly what you mean here as well, is that it's not really. And this was eye-opening to me, because there's always like, oh, where's the female Elon Musk or things like this? But it's like the system already is made so that we credit men more than women. And so, I really hope that this radical change can come about. And I certainly hope that this conversation that we had today can be, if it can even play a piece in that, I would be so honored. And with that, I want you to speak to our audience that we have today. If you have any message to our Japanese audience, that I'm sure they would love to hear it from you.
Sure. So I suppose a core message could be, I hope today's conversation, if you are someone who does a lot of emotional labor, I hope today's conversation didn't just help you understand it better, but validated your work and the importance of your work and the essential nature of your work. And I hope that with that validation, maybe you're able to see the way in which emotional labor dynamics plays out across your workplace or your private sphere. And I guess I would like to, because ideally a better world is a world in which it is emotional labor is shared. I want maybe to leave you with the message that you should never accept from anyone that they're not able to do emotional labor. We know from neuroscience and neuroplasticity findings that even someone who does not practice one skill is really able to develop it. Emotional labor is a skill that can be developed. People are wonderfully able to grow, and that growth is a very positive thing. So another world is possible. Your work is important. And I hope you go forward and have, good conversations that hopefully can start to affect meaningful change for you.
Thank you so much. That was very powerful. And I thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I certainly had a very valuable time with you. And I know that, working through the time difference was quite difficult, but I'm really, really glad that we were able to do this today. And I want to thank you again for coming on the show.
I'm thrilled to have been here. Thank you so much for having me. It was such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. ローズさん、ありがとうございました。本日のヒレタス TV はここまでとなります。本日午後7時から夜のポリタス TV もありますので、こちらもぜひご覧ください。皆様ご視聴ありがとうございました。また次回お目にかかりましょう。さようなら。